William Pullen, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here, particularly after all the struggle of we've had to change appointment times many times. Right now, it's about 8 in the evening in London where you are. It's noon here for me. And viewers, the listeners won't see this, but the viewers on YouTube will notice that I've got these sort of scars on my forehead, which has something to do with our having to reschedule a couple of times. And if you think I look bad, you should see the other guy. Except actually what's going on.
I hope you're not talking about me here.
No, I'm talking about me and these marks on my forehead from shingles. I unexpectedly got a case of shingles. And at first I wasn't even going to do video. And then I thought, well, I can just act like I was attacked or something. I was attacked out of the blue by this shingles thing. And so that's something that I've been dealing with. But I'm so glad that finally we in fact can have our interview and get together here to talk about your very fascinating book on dynamic running therapy. And I think most of us have heard that running could be a good thing to do if you're depressed or if you've got other kinds of psychological issues going on. But you really went into it in a very deep way, and I want to spend some time exploring that. So I'm really glad to have you on the show and the opportunity to discuss your work.
Correct.
So you are a therapist. We'll get into that. You are a therapist, and you've developed this sort of a closer look at how to use running as therapy than I think anybody else has, which makes your work fascinating. So tell us how you came to develop what you call DRT, which stands for Dynamic Running Therapy.
So I developed it about 11 years ago. I had a sort of personal crisis, went into therapy. Didn't feel like quite enough to me at the time to sort of really address my crisis. And so I took up running when I was not a runner before, but I rang up an old friend and together we arranged to meet in the park. And we started off walking and the walks became runs. But what I noticed was that actually I was getting more out of that than I was getting out of my therapy. I mean, the therapy was important. It was valuable. It felt helpful. But
what kind of therapy was it, if I may ask?
Oh, just regular person-centered therapy, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, office-based person-centered therapy with a nice therapist who was, you know, he was quite a formal therapist, wore a black suit and that sort of thing, although he wasn't a psychoanalyst. But we did a lot of psych education. We talked a lot of therapy, me and the therapist, and it reached in here quite well, and I recognized what he was talking about. But
reached into your head. People, not everybody's on camera here or has video, so you're pointing to your head, right?
I'm pointing to my head. It reached in here, and he was very good at building a bridge into the mind. However, my problem really was that I was feeling very emotionally overwhelmed, and somehow, you know, being an Englishman, we're fairly sort of repressed and told from an early age to, to control ourselves. And maybe that's
stiff upper lip and all that, right?
Upper lip, exactly. And maybe that's all men, but Englishmen maybe get a slightly extra dose of it. Anyway, point being that I took up running, and what I found with the running was not just that I could talk more easily with my friend, because somehow I didn't feel challenged by him. We were side by side, our eyes didn't lock, I wasn't worried about, it was a very different experience. The stories seemed to flow more naturally. I don't know if you've ever had that experience when you've been on a road trip or been on a long walk with somebody and your stories just sort of flow out of you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, particularly with walking. My imagination of running, I mean, I have run in the past, is that it can be hard to talk if you're going too fast. So I'm wondering about the pace. Were you running? Was it that you could talk as you were running, or you would run a bit, pause, and have a talk then?
Well, back then it was the sort of former as you're describing. It was as I built up my fitness, it was a bit of a messy affair, and probably more walking and talking than running with talking. In time, I got fit, and now, of course, I run with my clients. But you bring up a very good point, and that point is that, and a lot of people ask me this: how can you walk and how can you talk and run at the same time with your clients?
Yeah.
And the simple answer is that my sessions are led by the client. It is up to them to decide whether they want to sit, walk, run, whatever it may be. So
you're making a good point here, which is a lot of the book is about your personal story, and I want to get more of that, but also that you are using it as a therapy with clients.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of the book's about my personal story. I think only a page or two's in there, but there's certainly a lot in there about how I've learned and what I've learned about running and how it works, and what I've learned from my clients, and all the various advantages and disadvantages that there are.
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that you say you weren't all that fit when you began doing this, because, you know, generally when I think of a runner, and it sounds like you've gotten pretty serious about running, that they're terribly fit, right? And they're slim and athletic and so on. But so it's interesting to me that you didn't start out that way.
I didn't. And actually, if you look at the world of runners out there, if you go and look at your average marathon or half marathon, you'll see people with every body shape. You actually don't need to look like an extreme athlete to be able to run a marathon. Actually, it's surprising what some people look like and actually have really good fitness.
Oh, that's interesting, because I guess I did have a kind of a stereotype in my mind about what runners look like. And for a long time, I was a cyclist, and I went on, you know, some of these century bike rides just once or twice. And there were all sorts of unexpected body types there, people who looked, some people, not most, but some who looked quite heavy, and you wouldn't have thought that they could ride 100 miles on a bicycle.
So I haven't heard of these century races. I'm not a bike man myself.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit more about that. What, you do it all in one day or something?
Oh yeah, it's not, well, it's a race for some people, but generally it's a huge crowd of people who are interested in cycling. And
Yeah.
and so there's a course that you follow, and there are people at different posts on the course that can provide you with a bottle of water if you need it. And you pay money to enter, and you get a T-shirt at the end, typically.
And where do they find 100 miles of road to do this on?
Well, I'm fortunate to live in Sonoma County, which has kind of rolling hills and has become one of the bicycle meccas in the U.S. It's a wine growing region,
Yeah.
and so it's colorful, but there are issues of landowners and people who drive cars complaining about their progress being obstructed. But enough about me, really. I got to keep the focus on you here. Are you, as a reserved Englishman, can you say any more about what the issues were that you were struggling with when you decided, when you got into the process of developing this therapy?
Yeah, I mean, it was a relationship breakdown. I was dating somebody from another country. She was of another faith, another age, another everything that you
Yeah.
can imagine. There are all sorts of differences, and we tried to make it work. And in the end, it didn't. And I found myself rather, to put it mildly, rather bereft at the end of it. And I think it's, you know, I think this will be familiar to you perhaps, or to some of your listeners, that relationship experience. And there are many kinds of relationships we have, but this particular one had a recognizable one, I think, for some people, whereby you date somebody and you try to build bridges and understanding, and you find yourself crossing over the bridge, instead of meeting sort of halfway on the bridges, you sort of find yourself having to go further and further and further over onto their side of the bridge, just to try and keep this thing going.
Yeah.
Finally, it collapses, and there's very little left of you because you've given up so much of your territory. And that can be, that's how I've understood the experience anyway. And then it was that combined with just, you know, being a man and not knowing how to emote very well, not knowing how to express my feelings, not very well in words, and certainly not very well in my body.
And so did you become a therapist after that, or were you already a therapist?
No, I became a therapist after that. You know, that was my origin story. I went into therapy with this gentleman I was talking about, and I was with him for about a year. And about halfway through that, I took up the running. And then about a year after that, I decided to train as a therapist, which in this country takes about 6 years. And throughout that period, I tried to combine what I'd learned about running with what I was learning about psychotherapy.
Yeah. Okay. Good for you. So tell us about the therapy that you developed. Let's go into the details of it. You call it dynamic running therapy, and I suppose I should ask you what the word dynamic is meant to convey.
Movement.
Okay.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
But you'd be right to observe that it would be hard to run without being in movement. So it is perhaps somewhat redundant. You could have just had sort of running therapy, but I wanted to make it mine in some way. I wanted to differentiate from what would otherwise be a sort of generic term. Sure.
The word dynamic also conjures up for me, though, the world of psychodynamic. In other words, something that's oriented towards a depth therapy, towards a sense that some of our issues are driven by the unconscious and so on. Would that fit for you as well, or not?
No, not so much. I mean, I that's my personal belief of the world. Not so much in a Freudian way, more in a spiritual way or a Jungian way or something. But,
okay, well, I'm very interested in both of those, spiritual and Jungian. So yeah, characterize if you were you were studying to be a therapist for 6 years. So out of that, how did your therapeutic worldview evolve, and how would you characterize it beyond the running that you do? Okay, so I studied to become an integrative therapist. For your viewers, that means, for your listeners, that means a therapist that draws on, who is trained in several different approaches and draws on those approaches and combines them at times where he feels or she feels it's appropriate. Yeah, okay. In the introduction to your book, you say that DRT is a powerful and engaging step-by-step therapeutic method. Step-by-step, of course, sounds like a pun in a way, for confronting difficult feelings and circumstances in your life through movement. Yeah. And really it evolved, your approach really evolved out of your own inner work with this heartbreak that you were describing to us. Yes, exactly. I saw that in my own experience. I recognized how running and talking allowed my story to come out more naturally, more freely. I emoted with less reservation because I was using my body and my body was moving. So my body was in movement, which allowed my emotions to be in movement too. That's fascinating. You captured that with a phrase in the book where you say, emotion with motion. Yeah. And of course, and now that's kind of reminding me, at first I think, well, geez, I've run, I've bicycled. I don't know that I had experiences that were therapeutic, although I have to say that having done some very long bicycle rides one's mind is spinning. You can't turn off your that thinking apparatus just keeps going. And I did have relationship issues that I brooded over, and I don't know that I worked them through particularly. So at first, I just now I was thinking, how can motion facilitate that? But then, there's dance therapy. That's a very good example of what you're talking about, emotion with motion. So I think if there's an intent there or a guide to help that process to keep a person on point.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think about that, keeping on point?
Yeah, I don't know why it keeps it on point, but it does. There's a focus to it. I think because narratives, I suspect that we understand narratives in our bodies. We are travelers and journeymen by nature, aren't we? For a start, we journey through a lifetime from birth to death. We have a sense of that journey, perhaps more than any other. And so when we're journeying, quite literally going for a run, I think whether you're an Aborigine or an accountant from West London, I think you get a sense that, I am doing what I'm supposed to be doing, that when I talk and walk or talk and run, it's how it's supposed to be. I'm flowing in the world as I'm supposed to flow. And I think that's a critical point. We are supposed to flow, by the way. We're not supposed to sit in concrete boxes for 8 hours a day looking into little plastic, squares, one square on our desk and then a smaller one in our pocket. It's most definitely not what your biochemistry is primed for, and so it's just not going to make you happy for the most part.
Yeah, that's a good point, and a related point that you make in the book is that there's something about being in nature that's also healing, so that if possible, you recommend that people find a place in nature if they can, where there are trees and such. To augment that process that you're talking about.
In Japan, they have a thing which I know is now quite well known in America, called forest bathing, which is I think they've got 77 forests in Japan that you can visit and bathe in. And by that, they mean you show up and you go for a walk. But they recognize how healing that can be. And research has been done, and they've shown how the trees and plants throw off compounds called phytoncides, and these are oils that come off the trees and plants to protect them from insects mostly, and molds, and God knows what else. I'm not a scientist, but evidence seems to point to the fact that these are incredibly good for us, and they contribute to healthy mind and wellness. And then you've got all the other stuff which you'll be familiar with around how good it feels to be out, and there's plenty of data on space and fresh air and exercise reducing everything from blood pressure to stress levels to, the list is very long, and it's common sense, right?
Yes, yeah, and it also just raises my sense of alarm a bit, because it brings to mind the ecological crisis that the planet is in, and it seems like, what's that Joni Mitchell line? It's not. They put up a parking lot. It's not. I'm blocking on it, but people out there will know what I'm referring to. That it's not until you start to lose it that you begin to realize how much you're losing. And certainly that's the case in terms of what's going on ecologically with the planet right now.
But it's more than that, right? Because you've got, soon we're going to lose the last person who knew what it was like to live in the pre-digital age. The last person who remembers what it was like to exist without that level of connectivity. So that I remember, and I know you will, what it was like to live without mobile phones and wander down a street without anybody able to get in touch with you, with no way to get in touch with anybody else. You had to find a payphone if you wanted to ring somebody, and if you said you were going to be at a restaurant at 1 o'clock, you had to be there. There was no sort of, you didn't say, oh, I'm going to be 15 minutes late, or can we, do it next week, or should I do some work on the way there? You just had that nice walk there to get there, and it was a quiet time, and it was a time for you to reflect on yourself and your world. You didn't even do much reflecting. You just you were just being, really, weren't you? And now we're not human beings anymore, we're human doings.
Wow, that's a powerful point that you're making. I hadn't thought about the last non-digital person. There was a book some years ago about Ishi, the last, the subtitle was like the last, he was one of the last American Indians. And so he had that distinction of remembering of a whole way of life that had disappeared, being that last person. Well, that's very interesting. Has anybody speculated on when that will happen?
Well, you can do the maths yourself. I mean, what year did mobile phones come in?
I don't know. But I remember that they came in, and I remember that it was when I was teaching at Sonoma State University. So that would put it, somewhere within probably the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, I would say it was about 30 years ago.
Okay.
So,
and now it's such a big part of our life, and hardly any child will come into the world without that playing a strong role in their life. The phone.
And what's scary is that Africans now, pretty much all Africans have a mobile phone as well. And they're not just using the phone for speaking.
For talking to people, right.
they're using it to trade commodities on, they're doing all their banking on it. So they're even more, in a way, they're even more dependent on the phone than we are. At least all we're doing is going through Instagram photographs for the most part.
Yeah, and for them, it's their whole access to the World Web. So they're browsing and doing all that other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you looked at your average African, and obviously that's a broad brush it's a generalization, because Africa's a huge continent and the people are very different all across it. But let's say you're taking sort of sub-Saharan Africans, and I've just come back from Africa actually, but again, I'm far from an expert. But if you look at sort of tribal people, they have a mobile phone, but they tend to be fairly basic mobile phones. They don't tend to they're not doing a lot of browsing. They've got very, very limited amount of, it's not like they've got 4G and they're watching YouTube videos.
Okay.
It's for your average, I mean, they have in Nigeria, but for your average sort of sub-Saharan African, it's a little bit more basic than that.
Yeah. Well, I did not expect us to go in this direction, but it's certainly a topic that's of concern to me, and one that we could talk about quite a bit. Now, a component of your work is mindfulness.
Yeah.
And where does mindfulness fit into to the running? And mindfulness seems to be everywhere these days, and so.
Yeah, I sometimes.
How were you drawn into mindfulness? At what point in your training or experience, and how do you see it fitting into this therapy that you've developed?
So what I do is I offer my clients a process I call the grounding process, which, if they want to do it, we do typically at the beginning of the session, lasts about 10 minutes, and there are 4 steps to it. And the first 3 are sort of mindfulness exercises where we're focusing in on the senses and the body and emotions and so forth. And then the 4th one is an opportunity to focus on and elect, if you want to, what you want the session to be with, because I believe that there's something to be gained if you decide, if you make a line in the sand, you say, well, this is what I want this to be about. And then you run with that, sort of holding onto it. Stuff can come up. It's like a sort of filter that you're using. It can work that way. Or you can just say, well, I'll run and we'll just see what comes up. But to answer your question, personally, I came across mindfulness, I suppose, when everybody else started to, when it became fashionable, 7 or 8 years ago, something like that. And I took a course in my local Buddhist center. And I'm kind of Buddhist. I wouldn't identify as Buddhist, but I believe in a lot of that makes sense to me, put it that way.
Yes.
And I know there's a lot of Buddhism in California too, and Colorado, I think.
Right.
And I got a lot out of it. Do you do mindfulness meditation yourself?
I have, yes. Not highly disciplined, but yes.
Do you know what I've discovered myself is that, I don't know if you've read this, but there's a growing, or perhaps it's just more vocal body of people who are saying, look, mindfulness is not all good. It can be, there are times when mindfulness can be the wrong choice for some people. And I have discovered actually in my own practice, and perhaps, and I wouldn't call myself a master meditator, but I've been doing it on and off for quite a few years. And I certainly know a lot of the theory behind it. When I'm at my most emotional state, I'm talking about really upset, which happens a few times a year. If I'm really upset and I try to do my mindfulness meditation, it actually brings me a bit too close to the upsetness.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned that actually that's not the right time to do mindfulness meditation. It's just too upsetting. I suspect there are some people listening to this who would say, oh, well, you're supposed to be able to identify that emotion and say, oh, look, there I am. I'm feeling despair. There I go. I'm feeling abandonment. I'm feeling extreme, whatever it may be.
Yeah. So you know what you're supposed to do, but that's not your experience.
No, because I'm overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
By definition, I'm saying I'm overwhelmed in these moments. So I think it works, and it works wonderfully for me, mindfulness meditation, but not when I'm in extremely upset. Then I find it's best not to meditate.
Yeah, I think there's some research actually that shows that mindfulness, there's some people for whom it's probably not a good idea to be focusing inside and so on, that they need to get better connected with the outside world rather than less connected. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, what if you live in a city and you don't live in an area where there's easy access to, quotes, nature? Well,
I think that pretty much all cities have some green spaces. You can find it, head out of the city, but pretty much every city has parks in it. Just find a park,
Yeah.
Find a leafy neighborhood and wander around there. Explore a bit, that can be a lot of fun.
Or if you're lucky enough to live in a coastal area, I find all my life I felt the ocean as a kind of very healing presence.
Yeah. Yes, me too. There is one thing I'd add. The book is, as you know, it's called Running with Mindfulness, and it's got mindfulness in there: mindfulness running, mindfulness walking. However, it's also got these specific programs for running with depression, anxiety, anger, and various other conditions. And the book is a sort of guide to how you relate to yourself, and it gives you a bunch of questions to answer while you go on these runs and spaces to journal on it. The piece I want to say here about green spaces is that the book explains how you can go on these journeys, these DRT, depression journey, either by yourself or you can take a friend with you. Ideally, perhaps they have been through depression themselves. And then you can share that on something I call an empathy run, where you're sort of sharing the experience and one person's listening and one person's talking. But the piece I want to just add quickly for health and safety is, if you are going to be doing questions out of the book and running through a park, make sure you don't run into a car. Make sure it's somewhere you're familiar with. It can be distracting, getting involved in emotional questions. And I wouldn't want any of your listeners to distract themselves into the number 9 bus.
Yeah, well, that's a good caution because, I'm sure it's true there as it is here that the whole issue of distracted driving and I've experienced that because I like to listen to books when I'm driving. I listen to audible.com and novels that I'm involved in. And there have been times when I realize, whoa, I may have been too deeply into that book. I've certainly learned not to have phone conversations when I'm driving, because somehow that's very involving, and I can discover that I wasn't paying good attention because I realized, oh my goodness, I missed my turnoff. Yeah. I was so involved in this discussion. Well, I might have also missed that somebody was crossing the street. So yeah, that's an important area of concern. And certainly, as you point out, if I'm getting deep into my emotional issues, that would be a kind of distraction. You were lucky. Yeah.
I don't know if it's too personal a question. I'm just curious not on a superficial level. But I'm only looking for a superficial answer is what I should say. But how do you, when you're in emotional states, how do you treat your emotional states?
That's a good question.
Let's say you wake up tomorrow morning on the wrong side of the bed, as we say here in England, and you're, for whatever reason, you're miserable. What's your go-to?
I suppose just having routines, things that I do, like preparing for this podcast. So I have these responsibilities in my life. So I keep sort of hitting those points. That's one. Another is to kind of take a mindfulness stance towards it and to set it a bit on the shelf, if you will, and realize that this is not the only thing going on in the world and not the main thing. So things like that, I think, maybe I'm a member of a men's group, so sometimes that's a place to share things with other men who are in my general age range. And I have a couple other friendship groups that I get together with. So I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Well, a little bit. Are men's groups quite popular in America?
Boy, that's hard to answer. I would say no, except for those who are in them. But it's not like I think it kind of peaked, actually. I think there was a period there where Robert Bly was very influential in a certain part of the culture, the subculture. It's definitely a subculture of men who are inward looking, who are inward looking, and who maybe are somewhat feminized, really, who are closer to the feminine side of things, so that they're open to looking at their feelings, talking about their feelings, recognize a need for camaraderie with other men.
Yes, I've read Bly's book. And I know he set up the Mankind Project. I think he was influential in the Mankind Project as well.
Yeah, there are various workshops, and I think Sonoma County, where I am in, is one of the hot spots of that sort of thinking. And there are retreats. I haven't gone to any of the retreats, so I'm not in it hook, line, and sinker. but I've read much of that material and so on. I think you were very fortunate to have this friend, a male friend, I take it. Yeah. And did you already have a deep relationship, or did the process of doing this sharing together while walking and running did it deepen your relationship? Did it deepen your relationship for both of you?
Yes, I think it unquestionably did. I had known him probably a year or two by this point, and his name is Chris. He's still a friend. He's from Chicago. He's moved back there. But it turned out he was going through a divorce. Didn't know it at the time, but he was having some problems with his wife. I knew his wife, and he knew my ex as well. We would all get together on some occasions, if not too many. But I also knew him from playing poker nights. I knew him from other nefarious bad habits that we shared, and but unquestionably, this bridgehead of trust. And if there's a lot going on in your life, you know, you really, a lot comes spilling out, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that this opens up an interesting area for me because I'm aware of loneliness as being a rather pervasive problem in society today, and that a lot of men are lonely but don't know how to reach out or create a solid connection with other men, particularly as they get older. And so it seems like what you've done could be a good prescription for many men to as a way to get past that level of you know, what's your job, what do you do, what sign are you, etc.
Yeah.
Which I have found that, you know, in cocktail parties or other settings, you know, where I've casually met men, it's often really hard to get past anything other than just the standard chatter.
Yes, you know, it may be why so many people jump to sort of politics and start getting excited, because maybe that's a way to at least feel like, you know, you're involved in a real conversation. Because, yeah, all too often we find ourselves as men struggling. You know, in the book, there's something which I mentioned before called Empathy Runs, which I'm really proud of. And I talk about in a TEDx, I did a TEDx talk in Manchester 2 weeks ago, which will be up soon.
Oh, congratulations.
Thanks. And they're just editing that at the moment. And that talks a lot about that process and explains it for anybody who's interested in learning how to do it. But it's a very simple practice where two people go for a walk or a run, and one does the listening and one does the sharing, and then you swap roles at the end of it. But it's surprising how much comes out, and it's surprising how much trust is built just because somebody's agreed to go on this journey with you, and because they've stuck by you, you know, they've taken every step you've taken.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I really like that. And, you know, I think we men often, you talked about human being versus human doing. And I think as men, we have an inclination in the direction of being human doers. And so having a sport or a political alliance or something, you know, that's kind of the focus helps us.
Yeah.
So, you know, having a tennis partner, a running partner, a walking partner, it creates the possibility for developing that kind of relationship.
You know, right on after me in this TEDx conference was an American cardiologist from Kansas, and he was talking about sport and how good it is for you. He was talking about in terms of longevity study, not cardiovascular. This was measured out for longevity. And can you guess what sport added the most, which is about 8.5 years to your lifespan? Do you want to hazard a guess on what that was?
Well, given the context of our discussion, I'm going to say running.
No.
Okay, so if I don't have that, I'll go to walking.
No.
Golf? I know. I've never wanted to play golf.
Golf's up further up than the two you've just, or three you've just mentioned. So the thing is that what his research shows, his research shows that after a reasonable level of fitness, there's very little to be gained in terms of longevity by getting more and more fit. A guy that can run a marathon doesn't necessarily live any longer than a guy that can run a half marathon or 5 miles or 3 miles. So it's not about longevity, is not about high levels of cardio. What the research showed, strangely, was that it's actually about communal sports. So number one, doubles tennis. Why? Because you're using all of your body, and because you need to cooperate with your partner. You're being challenged in complex ways, and then there's a lot of what we call banter in this country. Do you use that word over there, banter?
Oh yeah, sure,
Okay.
banter. Yeah.
So there's a lot of banter going on, as you know,
Yeah.
and that's so there's high levels of socializing and you know, teasing and if it's mixed double.
Oh yeah, I've not had much experience with doubles tennis, but I was a tennis player at a very intermediate level, and actually my best friend, he kind of taught me how to play tennis, and a lot of it, you know, was talk about teasing. You know, we would act like we were hypnotizing the other guy, saying, "Your arm is getting weaker and weaker. You can barely hold your tennis racket up." There aren't that many people that you can do that with. You know, you can't go down to your local tennis court and start jumping at that level.
Yeah. And you don't play with him anymore.
He had to move away, and yeah, that's been the main thing. Yeah, the main difficulty. And I have another friend that we've done a lot of bonding over tennis. Not so much lately because his physical ailment, my physical ailment, things have kind of gotten in the way, unfortunately. But we had sort of sunk to the level of just hitting the ball back and forth without trying to keep score or anything. But still, it creates enough of that space for the sharing, some physical activity. And
do you know what he had, this gentleman from Kansas had in number 2, if my memory is correct, and maybe this is something you could try out, is badminton. Which is, you know, it's a little less physical if you're just knocking it over the net to each other.
Yeah.
If you're knocking it behind somebody, then it's even more physical, I think, than tennis.
Huh. Yeah, we don't have badminton. I wouldn't know where to go to play badminton. There's probably some place, but it's not. Is it bigger there than it is here? Are there badminton?
Not so much. I think in Asia, it's probably at its biggest.
Yeah, yeah. What about table tennis?
I think that's having a little bit of a resurgence here, actually.
Yeah.
But you know, in Okinawa, where the people live longest in the world, depending on what metrics you look at, I suppose, age of death. The reason they say that they live longest in Okinawa, you probably know this, apart from things like diet and eating practices. They stop eating before they're full, things like that. But the major thing is because, and I grew up in Asia, is that Asians, they have a strong social bonds. They do a lot of stuff together right up until they're 100 years old. They're playing mahjong together. And when they play mahjong, it's not just one person playing his mate mahjong. It's 4 on a table, and there's 5 or 10 tables in a room. So they like to do it all together, and they like to play sports together and do the, you know, Tai Chi and whatever it is that they do.
Yeah, I've been doing Tai Chi, and also more recently gotten into going to a gym, and I have a trainer twice a week, and there's something called Silver Sneakers for seniors. It's an hour-long sort of fitness kind of class, and I was shocked to learn that at least in this particular gym, this particular program, that the gym seems to be a place where older retired people go to hang out. And that was a big surprise to me, because I've always thought of a gym as a place where big buff athletic people are pumping up, you know, and I've always thought, oh, it's just so supremely boring and repetitive. And so it's been kind of an eye-opener for me to discover that hey, this might be, this could be an avenue for somebody
Yeah.
who's retired. I've been retired now for 13 years, so, but I'm still looking for the avenues and the.
Yeah,
So,
no, I mean, yeah, as you said, your friends move away, friends pass away, and it becomes, I think, more important than ever to socialize when you get older, and
yeah,
whatever avenues there are, somewhere like a health club is a fantastic place to do it. If you can do your silver thing you mentioned, and then have a cup of coffee, and then have a game of tennis or whatever it is you're doing, to be able to mix all of that up, I think is
yeah,
just fantastic. Great way to meet members of the opposite sex or the same sex if that's your thing. It's just brilliant.
yeah, yeah. Um, well, I'm glad that you mentioned those sections of the book because I've been a little while since I read it. That I was forgetting it, where you've got all of these sort of priming questions and activities that people can do, which will give them ways to focus in. And you've got valuable chapters on things like anxiety and depression and empathy and uh, anger. So I love the way that you have taken the idea of running further than maybe somebody else has done it, but I wasn't aware of that, and kind of differentiated it.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think the great thing about it is the book costs whatever it costs, and for the price of a book, and that's the only entry ticket that you need, because it's the rest of it's free, right? You can do running. Anybody can go running anytime, anywhere that they like, unless you're in prison.
yeah,
Even then, they'll let you out every now and then for a run around the yard.
and even if you can't run, you can walk, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And there's something about, actually, I remember reading in the American Psychologist journal, there was a group of articles, I think, that were sort of involves some research that had been done having to do with walking side by side with someone and as a form of doing therapy.
Yeah.
So I think that this is an idea that's gaining some currency.
Most definitely. I mean, imagine how long we've been walking side by side. I mean, since we came down from the trees, before we had language, there's half a million years right there, or is it? I'm not an anthropologist, but it's hundreds of thousands or millions of years where we were sort of half standing up or half on all fours or whatever we were, moving side by side for, when we were hunter-gatherers, going vast distances, traveling together. That's what we did. There was nothing else to do. You went for a walk.
Right.
And so those walks were massively important, and they remain massively important.
Yeah.
I believe that one of the reasons this works so well therapeutically is because research shows that the Therapeutic Alliance, that bond between the client and the therapist, is the most important single element of any therapeutic approach. As you know, there are hundreds of therapeutic approaches now, and it's very hard to measure outcomes, but to the extent that you can, it seems that the Therapeutic Alliance is the most important quality. And I believe, in my experience, and I work both office-based and I work in the park running with my clients doing DRT, I believe that it accelerates the uptake, the establishment of the Therapeutic Alliance. I think that moving together, the moving side by side, the power dynamic is very different. They see that I've come as far as they've come. They see me breathing and working hard for it. I'm not sitting behind a desk and they've had to come to me. We're out there doing this thing together. We may not be on the same journey, but in these moments, we're on the same path.
Yeah, yeah. Are people starting to hear about you? Do people come to you because they want that approach to therapy?
Yeah. It's got, it's got quite a fair bit of press here and in the States.
Yeah, I think, you know, what with between your book and now the TEDx, maybe that will happen increasingly. And how good for you, you know, that you can, that you're not tied to a desk in an office in the typical therapy way, but that, I mean, you're in an enviable position, right? That you have comfortably staked out this territory for yourself that keeps you active and moving and not passively nodding your head.
I get to share the very thing that saved me and saves me. It still saves me. I still go to exercise and walking and talking. I still do it today. It's my go-to with some meditation and you know, socializing or whatever. But it remains incredibly important to me. And actually trying to get the message out in America, which is why I'm, you know, enjoy doing these podcasts. I'm really trying to get that word out in the States. I know of another running therapist who works in California who's fantastic. And I'm really hoping to spread the message, and indeed maybe even move back. You know, I used to live in Wake Forest. No, I went to Wake Forest University briefly, and the University of Miami. I lived in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Okay, yeah.
So, and Florida. I lived in Miami, and I lived on the west coast of Florida. So I'm actually thinking about, at some point, not now, but maybe in a couple of years or a few years' time, maybe moving back to the States.
Well, move to Sonoma County.
I'd love to. Can I come and join you?
I would love hanging out with you and
great.
Walking, running, playing tennis, etc. So this is probably a good place for us to wrap it up.
Okay.
William Pullen, I want to thank you for your contribution to the world and for the opportunity to speak with you on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. It's been nice spending time with you.